Today we're going to talk about children and bilingualism. So I'm going to kind of approach this from a couple different perspectives because I think this is a really interesting topic. It's actually what I studied during my master's program. And I think it's especially relevant because we are at Cal State San Marcos. We are on the US-Mexico border region. It's a beautiful, diverse culture that we have, kind of bridging two cultures together on a border that has been changing recently due to just changes within our world, changes to security, changes to administration, things like that. So I want to kind of touch on how children are bilingual. So this isn't specifically about children who are learning Spanish and English, but that is most of my experience, both practically and then what I specifically studied in grad school. I am going to touch on bilingual education because the law has changed in California as of 2016. And then I'm going to touch on the pre-seed model, but I'm going to go more into kind of research methods because I want to cycle back to what you read before. I'm sorry, I'm going to cycle back to what you just read last week when I talked about research designs and methods. So I'm going to cycle back to that and kind of reinforce some of that knowledge. So first I'm going to start off with language literacy and learning. This is for children that are learning English as a second language. So where I got this information, I did not come up with any of this. I pulled some practices and principles from West Ed. So this is a collaborative effort. It's a training that I went to back in 2016, but it was a way that the California Department of Education and then West Ed, which has the Center for Child and Family Studies, they do a lot of videos and trainings for anybody who works with children in California. This is kind of what they put out in order to support caregivers, trainers, and families who are working with preschool-age children and supporting those children. It really can support children of most ages. And since this class is 0 to 12, any of these types of principles and practices that I'm going over will help you in your work, either as a therapist, a possible nurse, or an educator or a social services. This will help you support families, support their children's education. So, let me move my big head. So education for English learners is enhanced when programs and families partner around education. So all of these areas that I'm going to be talking about in the next couple slides are specific principles and practices from the bilingual program or the English language learner program with West Ed that I just talked about. So I did not come up with any of these, but they are fantastic and they have definitely informed my work in the classroom, my work supporting teachers in the classroom, and then students that I work with as well. So the first thing we do is we kind of honor the fact that families have multiple responsibilities and that families are juggling a lot of different things on a daily basis. So while bilingual education and education in general might be the most important thing to us because that's what we're paid to think about, it might not be for the family. So this might be a small part of a varied life that they have to do, a very heavy work life. There might be ACEs going on in the home. So we need to understand and recognize that there are lots of responsibilities and they might not have the time, effort, and ability to focus on education and bilingual education like we would like families to. And I think this is why I really wanted to bring this up, is this is where the pre-seed proceed model would really come into play. What does the community need? Especially if you were looking at a preschool, and I'll talk about my own research that I did, which was in a preschool. So if you have preschool families that are struggling with having their children attain bilingual ability before they enter kindergarten, what are factors that enable that, that are pre-existing, that type of stuff, identifying factors and outcomes so that you can support families in things that they can do. You can't do everything, but what can you do? I also like that we kind of share and model the belief that parents' involvement in their children's education result in better long-term academic development and social and emotional development. And we know this, so telling families and then modeling, I think that's more important. You are important. As a parent, you are important. Whatever effort you put forth in your child, you will have that paid back to you. And then allowing families to determine how they need support. And this definitely comes down to our pre-seed proceed movement model as well. What kind of support do they need? It's coming from a community needs assessment. So what need do they need and how are they going to communicate it with us? And also with the pre-seed proceed movement, how are they going to share their skills with the educator? So specifically in the classroom, this kind of comes down to, so maybe if family isn't bilingual, maybe they can't write, maybe they're not literate, but they have other skills, and those skills need to be honored and they need to be shared within the classroom. When I was going to school, my dad loves education, but he didn't want to spend another part of his work week sitting in a classroom when he was sitting in an office. So he always signed up to like see the sports fields or draw the lines or rip out the concrete or something like that, because he wanted to be able to move his body when he was not at work. And so we needed to give him an opportunity in order to support the school that allowed for his needs as well. And then for families that maybe are not bilingual, offering them ways within their own home language that they can share their skills and their abilities with the educators. Previously, when I had taught preschool within a school district, it was Vista Unified, I had a lot of bilingual families, I had a lot of Spanish-speaking families, and I had some illiterate families as well, illiterate both in English and Spanish, or English and Korean, or English and Vietnamese. And so we always had a lot of cultural activities where they could bring and they could show us specific things. So we would have abuelas come and make us tortillas, or we would have families from Korea show us dolls and clothes, things like that. So even though they weren't specifically bilingual, they were still able to bring a part of their culture in with us, and that was really important. So we know that children benefit when teachers, and I think when I talk about educators, this is what this principles and practices was built on, but you could put in nurse, you could put in physical therapist, occupational therapist, social worker, anything like that, and that will still work. So children benefit when a professional understands and incorporates cultural differences into language and they use it within routines. So we use culturally responsive practices. So not everybody knows every single culture, but if you are open to learning about another culture, then that's all that really matters. I love my work with Regional Center and with children with special needs because I have a lot of diverse families. I want to actually tally it up, but I've worked in that program with at least 12 nationalities. So my first time working with a family from Afghanistan, that was not something that I knew a lot about. I worked with Iraqi and Iranian immigrants before, but I hadn't really worked with an Afghani family. And so I didn't want to take my information about other Middle Eastern countries and try to kind of mishmash that into something that I really didn't know. So I was just really open to learning from her, and she was really open to sharing with me. I don't typically eat in sessions, that's not really appropriate, but sometimes when I was doing notes, she would bring over a taste of something for me to share, and that's happened a lot. That's kind of the bridge, that's the way that people want to explain that to you. If you go into somebody's home and you're there once or twice, you're not a regular visitor, it is a good practice for you to take that cup of coffee or that cup of tea, the treat, whatever it is, and even if it tastes a little bit unusual, maybe not something that you're used to, or maybe you're just a really picky eater, you just want to eat white bread and mayo all day, that's fine, but enjoy it. Understand that as they are giving you food, you are taking in part of their culture, and you should express delight in that opportunity that has been given to you. We also want to allow children to express themselves in multiple ways. I remember getting really upset when I went to my grad school in London, although all of my research was about the U.S.-Mexico border region, and I did some of it down here, but all of my theoretical work was done in London. I remember I had a fellow student who was getting ready to teach what is their high school, which is quite different. But he had a lot, as a student teacher, he had a lot of people from India who were not, India and the Caribbean, so post-colonial parts of the world that used to be the colonies of the UK. And so it was really difficult because everything was in English. Like even math, it wasn't just algebra, or science, it wasn't like looking at scientific equations and chemistry. Everything was written out in English. So we were stopping the children that probably were really good in math and science from being able to show us because everything was in English and it wasn't translated into the language that they knew. So we were being doubly stacked against children to not be able to show us and allow themselves to express themselves. With young children, this is having scarves and flannel stories and role playing, and our classrooms with younger children can be a lot more open to these types of things. But as children grow older, we need to allow them ways, and most likely it's a creative way to express themselves. I think the best thing is to visit the home and observe the child and family, how they live and how they interact. This will also give you the opportunity to do an informal assessment of how many ACEs there are, if there's domestic violence, if there's poverty, things like that. We are going to have to be multidisciplinary. We are going to have to look at those ACEs. We're also going to look at the educational goals or the bilingual goals that we have with this child, because they are going to be linked. You're not going to be able to learn a second language if your home life is really difficult. But maybe your home life is fantastic, but there's not a lot of reading materials, or there is a lot of reading materials, but they're all in English, and it would probably be best if they were in English and in Spanish, or in Korean and in English, you know, something like that. So valuing what the home language is and what the child already knows, and then also providing models and opportunities to look at the new language that they're learning. So culture and subject matter is presented and is reinforced in the home language, and that culture is as equally valid as the majority language. So I'm going to be talking about majority language, and really what the majority language is English. It's what we speak at courthouses, in classrooms, in IEP meetings, in Congress, in corporations, all those types of things is English. That is what I consider our majority language. It's not to say that people speak a minority language and that they're less of in that way, but that is just kind of how I think about it. So we want to promote shared experiences in a language which is used as a meaningful tool to communicate interests, ideas, and emotions. And for our younger children, it's a lot of sign language, picture symbols, anything like that. But I think that the culture is the most important thing. So even though we want them to learn the majority language, we still reinforce that the home language and the home culture is just as important as English. So English language learning is promoted when teachers and children interact creatively. And this, once again, is much more easy in early childhood education. As we grow older, our curriculum can become a little bit stifled. We have standards and Common Core curriculum and things like that. Not to say that there is not a creative place in formal education, but it is a little bit easier to do this with young children. But we're encouraging pretend play, puppets, role playing, flannel boards, selective screen time. And when we're doing that, we're responding. So even if they are doing pretend play in Korean, that's fantastic. They are still using language to interact with us. We're gonna nod, yeah, that's interesting, yeah, You have no idea what the child just said to me. It's in a language I know not a word in. I might want to use my eye contact as well, although you do need to be aware that certain cultures teach their children not to have eye contact or to have less eye contact with their educators or their elders, that type of stuff. So you have to be aware of how the children use eye contact, and I typically go by what they do, and I kind of, you know, reinforce what they are doing with me already, but you can always ask the families how they grew up. Are they supposed to look at their educator or the professional in the face, or are they supposed to look down as like a sign of, you know, you are my teacher and I respect you. So we're experimenting with use, form, purpose, and intent. So when you're first learning a language, you are learning and growing in acquisition in your second language, and so you're going to change things. You're going to need to use form and purpose and intent, and a lot of this comes down to code switching. So it's kind of how you use both languages. You'll typically use the syntax or something of how, or sentence structure or grammar in one language, but then you'll put in words from another language that you already have the vocabulary in. So I put the fork in la mesa. I put the fork on top of the table. You would tell a teacher if she asked if you put your stuff away at the end of family style dining in the preschool classroom. When children do that, don't correct them, just serve as a model for the child. It's the same as in any language. If they get their tenses mixed up, I had given an example weeks ago, just serve as oh, you put the fork on top of the table, awesome, thank you so much. Because we're celebrating, we're encouraging those attempts at the new language. It's really hard to learn a new language. I am coming to you as only knowing one language. I worked really hard in college to try to learn Spanish. I took lots and lots of classes, and it never took, the most I ever got was about 5 years ago when I was working a lot in Escondido, and I was working a lot with bilingual families because I heard it every day. And In college, I didn't. I only heard it in a classroom environment. I wish I could have been able to bridge the two. What I really wish is that my godparents, who are from Guadalajara, had spoken Spanish to me when I was younger. They only use Spanish with my parents, who also speak a bit as well, in order to try to like keep secrets, like offering ice cream or stuff like that. Talking about desserts and things like that was done in Spanish. So I've learned those words, but I am definitely not bilingual. I wish that I was. I actually wish that I had learned younger. We know that it's better to learn languages in the first 5 years. And that children who know 2 languages, their brains are 5% bigger than somebody who is just proficient in 1 language. So a lot of you I know are bilingual. Your brains are 5% bigger than mine. So please encourage people to be bilingual. It's a wonderful, fantastic thing. Not only does it bridge 2 cultures that you might be raised in, it also can also lead to job positions and things like that. I know within my specific job at Regional Center, I would be getting paid more if I was to provide services in Spanish or Korean or anything like that. So I wish that I was. So getting back, as a side note, coordination and collaboration among families, teachers, and specialists is crucial for children with special needs. So I like to identify how families need communication. Do they need it written? Do they need it verbal? Do they need it both? I work with a lot of bilingual families. The parents have to be bilingual. It doesn't matter about the child because they are under the age of 3, and I can speak enough language to get along with a 3-year-old. So not much. So how do they need communication? And then specifically, do I need to have my reports translated into Spanish for them? Support family goals and the IFSP, IEP goals. Years ago, working with lots of different families, one woman was undocumented, and she shared with me that she wanted to become a dreamer. So this was about 5 years ago, 3 years ago, something like that. But she was eligible and passing on information about clinics and things like that where she could go and do that. So a family had a specific goal, and then we also had her goals within the child's life. Language acquisition in just 1 language, because we had 1 word, mas, at that point. So we were just trying to add any kind of Spanish or English vocabulary that we could. So I was supporting both families' goals. Provide opportunities for bilingual children to interact with those who do not have special needs and in any language. So just providing opportunities on the playground, at parks, anything like that, to have a wide variety of peers that you play with who speak a wide variety of languages and have a wide variety of needs will model for that child and will allow that child to be socially integrated. And then adapting specialized materials. So a lot of the Mormons and Seventh-day Adventists and the people who come door to door with their religion have done a fantastic job of taking Braille materials and translating them into other languages. They are doing a fantastic job of taking the Bible or the Book of Mormon or whatever it is and translating it into millions of languages and millions of ways of people with special needs to also access that. We could probably, as service providers, learn from that model of how they're doing it. I'm not saying learn about proselytizing, I'm saying learning about providing materials in the way that people learn. So engaging multiple literacy practices, so singing songs, reading poetry, looking at the mail, sending mail, so writing out where your grandma lives, writing out her address, where we live, where do things go, playing board games, reading the instructions of board games, reading cookbooks, cooking, telling folk tales, popular magazines, and then supporting family conversations. So literacy and language learning encompasses lots of different models. So it's not just sitting down and reading a book in English, which might be a little intimidating to a family that feels insecure about their ability in English, but they can sing songs, they can read poetry, they can sing nursery songs. All of these things parents for any age child can do to support their learning, both in the home language and in English. When I'm kind of giving this, I am assuming that a family wants to learn English. There are going to be better outcomes if the family does have the ability to communicate a little bit with English with educators. I've seen it firsthand with my families who have special needs. So you have an IEP when you turn 3 years old, and it's a big thing. There's a lot of assessments that go into it. It can take a lot longer, and the meetings are not as successful, in my opinion, when the family only speaks English. So for example, I had a family in Vista. Mom was bilingual, but she felt more comfortable in Spanish. We spent the hour that we had for her IEP having the reports that all of these therapists had written translated in the moment into Spanish for her. And that could have been served with that mom better advocating for her child. Her child actually ended up with no services being offered. And we were at the end of the hour, and she kind of felt confused about what happened next. As an advocate with her, I was trying to help her understand that she didn't have to sign it, but it was a kind of a difficult situation. So what kind of happened was they agreed to go back in 6 months. So when the child was 3.5, and kind of work on things with her and reassess her at that point. I think if the parent had felt she had English skills, and I think if she had felt more confident in the moment, then we could have had a better and more successful moment. So I think that there are better outcomes if parents know a little bit of, they know their home language or the language that they were raised in, and they can also negotiate within the majority language in order to advocate for their child's needs. But that is a perspective and possibly a bias on my point. That is what all of these PowerPoints are about, though, is honoring both languages and building both languages into the education system. So we want to also provide opportunities to explore written materials. So there's this idea in early childhood education called print-rich environment. And what this is like everything is labeled. So chairs, tables, walls, bookshelves, that type of stuff. In my classrooms, they were most likely labeled in English and Spanish as well. And it's the kind of idea that words have meaning and words can be linked in how you can label things. And that's from infants all the way up into even kindergartners, I think, really can benefit from that. Even probably first graders who are still working on spelling and things like that. It also is the idea that print comes in many forms. So it's not just in your reading area or at circle time or at reading time. It's in the dramatic play area where you are writing menus, you're looking at menus. Menus come in Korean, Chinese, Vietnamese, Afghani, Spanish, English. So like I gave them away, but I had the most amazing menu collection for my preschools in the classrooms that I ran. So that was a wide variety of different languages that they got to see. So for English and Spanish, kind of seeing how words go across, but then in different languages up and down, there's differences in honoring and respecting those differences. And then expanding on whatever effort the child does put forth. So if they're writing, if they're scribbling, we still honor and then expand on that. So if they're writing things that are maybe not correct or written well or something like that, then we can expand on that and we can give them more vocabulary, more syntax, more grammar, things like that. And then once again, communicating the importance of reading, any type of reading to the family, the daily newspaper in Spanish, the menu in Vietnamese, picking up mail and reading it from your grandma and grandpa in France, you know, that type of stuff. So even if you are not fluent in another language, you should still be reading in the language that you can read in to your child. If you cannot read, then you are telling them, singing them lullabies, telling them stories from memory, nursery rhymes, things like that. So are you still engaging in some kind of literacy activity with them? So I want to jump to bilingualism and bilingual education. So I do want to talk about the 3 types of bilingualism. So there's simultaneous, successive, and receptive bilingualism. If this is interesting to you or you want to know more about it, there is so much to know about bilingualism, how children become bilingual, and bilingual education. This is like the top of the iceberg. I wanted to, and that's why I gave you all of those slides before, is make it as practical and as user-friendly as possible so you could go out and you could support children learning 2 or 3 languages in your nursing practice, your therapy practice, as a social service professional, something like that, so that you can take what you're learning in human development and you can then put it into a professional practice. If bilingualism is something that's interesting to you, there's so much more to it than this. This is just the basics so you can kind of understand how children learn. So simultaneous is you're learning two languages at the same time. So your mom and your dad are fluent in English and Spanish. You are learning them simultaneously. Successive, you learn a second language after reaching early mastery in one. My best friend in high school came to the United States when he was in first grade. So he had a strong mastery of being able to read and write to a kindergarten level in Spanish. Then he came and he went to a school that did not have bilingual education. He was just thrown into English, and he learned a second language after reaching mastery in one. And then the receptive, children understand a lot more. They're receptive, and what they can hear and understand is a lot better than expressive language. I would say that that's true with everybody. I'll have a lot of grandma and grandpas who pretend not to understand English when I work in the home, and then I've sometimes told funny jokes and I'll have one of them laugh at it, and I know that their English is always much better than they pretend it is. But for children, we know that they understand more than they have expressive language. So learning a second language without opportunity, we need to offer them opportunities to show us how much they have learned and how much they can understand. And then we also need to give them opportunities to speak their second language as much as possible. So they might be hearing it constantly and they've got that receptive language, but offering opportunities to speak the second language without it having be graded or tested, and just practice it on the playground, and recess in a non-pressure kind of environment. So that can still be classroom in time, but being able to practice it as much as possible is going to help children. Then the home language, and really I've talked about that, and this is probably the second point of this bilingual education, is you must recognize, support, and honor the home language. So if I work with anybody bilingual who speaks any kind of language, I have a bunch of forms that I've gotten and made photocopies of, and it's basically your home language matters, your home culture matters. You'll be teaching your child English, I'll be working with your child in English, but what you do at home matters greatly. And that's kind of just the basic point of this whole thing. Then there's bilingual education, as we know it in formal education. So I remember this Prop 227, 227 in 1998 because I was 17, almost 18 years old. So I was in high school when it happened. And it ended bilingual education. So it really kind of said that there was a lot of English only instruction and things like that. And it kind of removed restriction. So what we have now in 2016 with Prop 58 is multilingual instruction. It takes various forms depending on the population that you serve and the school district, which I think is a good thing. Unfortunately, that can change service and quality, but who we are in San Diego is going to be really different than who we are in Humboldt County. The amount of immigrants that we have, the amount of different languages that we have, you should see the materials that I have. If I have a diverse population, which I did in Escondido, I had 6 different languages that we had translated some of our really important materials into. And that was fantastic, and I'm glad we did that. I'm glad we spent the time and the money and the energy on that, because that's really important. But you might not need to do that in other parts of the country. So depending on the population that you serve, even within a school district, can change how this is going to happen. So this image just kind of talks about talking to the community, finding out what their English learner programs are, removing restrictions on bilingual programs. And then I think what we've kind of learned, especially in the Audis, is honoring the home language and not taking that out of the equation, building on the syntax and the grammar that you already have in one language, if you're learning it successively, or if you're learning it simultaneously, having both of those together. And this just talks about Prop 58. There's a lot of controversy about this from various types of people. Richard Rodriguez wrote Hunger for Memory, which is a fantastic book. And if you are at all interested in bilingual education, it's kind of one of the cornerstones of it. And in it, he does not like bilingual education. He did not have a bilingual education, and he thinks that it holds children back. My friend that I was just talking about that came up from Mexico when he was in first grade did not receive any bilingual education, and he's against it as well. He thinks everything should be English only, and that he thinks it leads to better outcomes. The Stand and Deliver movie, which was Escalante, I don't remember what his first name was, Jaime, I think. So teaching calculus to students in East LA, and they having amazing. You should watch the movie. It's fantastic. I'm not going to give you any spoilers right now, but those are really big detractors from bilingual education. And then there are people who, like myself, are very into bilingual education, and we have our own perspectives as well. I think the problem is that we don't have the opportunity to have deep conversations based on research instead of emotions or past experience, personal experiences. So I think that we need to have bigger, deeper conversations like this on a society level, so that there's never going to be consensus. But how can we support things like Prop 58 if we are having so much controversy over it? I think that simultaneously we need to explore the ideas of how our society supports bilingualism and people having different languages, while also allowing people to have their past experiences and past perspectives as well. I want to jump into something else though, which is research. The pre-seed proceed model doesn't have research about actual bilingualism as much as I can tell. But because this is a community needs assessment and we're looking at structures for health needs, and we design and implement and evaluate health promotion, translation, bilingualism, biculturalism is going to be built into the program. So if you were working with a population like migrants or migrant workers in the field, obviously Spanish and then other indigenous languages would be built into the pre-seed proceed model, because you need to be able to communicate with them and they need to be able to communicate with you. And it's probably also best served by a bicultural guide, somebody who kind of has straddled both worlds and can be more culturally approachable and be more culturally sensitive in doing this kind of pre-seed proceed model. I do want to talk about the research design. So I found these open educational resources a couple weeks ago, in early March actually. So I've been trying to find a text to support designs and methods of learning research that were open and educational. So I didn't want to just give you Wikipedia, I wanted to give you an actual kind of text source. But since this is a zero textbook class, which I love and completely support, I have been struggling to find it. So what I kind of put on Cougar Courses last week on the research design and methods was this open educational resource that I had just found. So that means that it's free for you guys to look at, and it is kind of a text source. But I wanted to reinforce some of that knowledge, some of those words, some of those things that we have been looking at throughout this class, words that you need to know in order to give you deeper understandings of the policy papers and the articles that I give you each week. And then also when you go into the other classes, you're taking this kind of understanding of research design and methods, and you'll be able to apply them to the 303 and the 304. So these are some types of methods. So observation, obviously watching and recording the actions of participants, either as a participant yourself or as an observer. So when I'm going to talk about my own research in a minute, because it was some qualitative research that I had done, but I started with some observations. But I had actually been a preschool teacher in that classroom the summer previous. So I was also a participant as well, and I noted when I was a participant. So experiments, that's kind of really, you have a hypothesis. So a lot of the conditioning, classical conditioning and operant conditioning. So you have a hypothesis about a child, and then you do some kind of test or experiment in order to prove it. Then case studies. Case studies are really interesting. So really what we're kind of do is we're looking at a situation or a person, and we're trying to uncover as much as possible with interviews and stuff like that. So like children, like wild children that we find that were raised by wolves, or the children in Riverside who had that really horrific abuse case where they were like 27, but they looked like they were 7 because they had been raised in a super abusive home. It just broke the news a couple months ago. They will guaranteed be a case study of somebody's. So they will be interviewed, they will be tested cognitively, all this type of stuff to figure out about how extreme neglect and abuse can impact somebody's health and their development. Surveys, we've all done surveys, are guaranteed because you can do it on the phone, on mail, online, through person. You're typically given some kind of perk for doing it. So you might get one online and you get a $25 gift card. I see them all the time at Cal State or in the Reader, things like that. You come do a survey and you get, $5 at Walmart or something like that. Then content analysis, I think is really interesting. It's something I didn't really know about until grad school, but I had quite a few people who are in media studies and use this a lot. So looking at text, pictures, commercials, lyrics, other materials to look at patterns or themes in culture. So I didn't really understand why I had all these media people in my Institute of Education program. Like, what does media and education have to do? Well, there were two kind of parts: educating people about media, and then educating yourselves about media and looking about how you can learn about education through studying the media. The longitudinal is really cool as well. So people of the same age observed or studied over a long time. I had posted a couple weeks ago in a discussion post of somebody about the 7 Up series, which is also from England. It's expensive if you buy it, so don't buy it. But there are YouTube clips online. They started studying the kids in the 1950s in England, and they are still doing it up to this day. It's called 7 Up because every 7 years they film them again. It's not a true longitudinal study in that we use research designs, but it's an interesting way to look at people through the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and into a new century and millennium, and how they have changed over their lifespan. It's kind of interesting because they also looked a lot at social class as well, which was a big issue in the 1950s in England. Then there's developmental. This is a big area to us. Techniques to kind of examine how age, cohort, gender, and social class impact development. So a lot of the stuff that we look at with the pre-seed, proceed movement, and then the ecological part of child development as well, kind of Uri Brofenbrenner's ideas about how the systems around you impact your development. So qualitative research. I'm going to give you the example of the research that I did. I was a master's student. I was 23 years old. It's never been published. I have a 150-page dissertation somewhere in my house, and I also have it in my Gmail as well. So it's never going to see the light of day. It was not, your highest quality research, but it's going to give you an example of ways that you can do it. So I had a broad area of interest that I was beginning with, which was the U.S.-Mexico border region, the children who I had been working with when I was going to college, which were at a preschool in Escondido. So I knew that I wanted to look at bilingual education, and I knew because my master's was about childhood studies, which is more the sociology of childhood. So I was really examining children's perspectives and ideas on their own life. So we really kind of started with this idea that children should be talked to and interviewed in research when possible because they have their own perspectives, which should be valued as much as anybody else's. So I went to back to the preschool where I had worked, and they allowed me to do research. I did opt-out research because I was only interviewing and observing. Typically you do opt-in, but I knew that in this specific population that was going to be really difficult to do. It brings up some ethical issues, and that parents literally had to sign if they didn't want their child to do it. So I had 2 parents who did not want their child to be observed, recorded, or interviewed, and that was fine. They were always taken out of the groups when I was doing that. Otherwise, I had a group of 20 students that I was looking at. I did a lot of field notes about the setting, what it looked like. I described all of that stuff, the people, the structure, the playgrounds, the classrooms, diagrams of what it looked like, what the schedule was, all that type of stuff was included in my research. Then when I actually interviewed students, I had a lot of observations. I had about 2 weeks of observations that I did at 3 to 4 hours a day in the morning and in the afternoon. And then I had really broad questions that I talked about when I was interviewing my subjects who were 3 and 4-year-olds. So we had a kind of classroom off to the side that was very quiet, and I had a lot of butcher board paper, and I had different people that I had cut out in houses and churches, things that they would, playgrounds, streets, things like that. So we kind of made maps of their lives. Then I kind of asked general questions about who spoke English and who spoke Spanish, because I was starting to refine my ideas about when are children really aware of who in their life speaks what language and who speaks the majority language and who doesn't. Then I kind of, that was my modifying. So I now had a less of a broad, it was really refined to children's perspectives, and then bilingualism, and then the majority language. Then I kind of looked at patterns and consistencies and explored new areas as well. And then I reported my findings. I tried to kind of do some bar graphs and simple graphs as well to kind of talk about the fact that out of 20 children, I think it was 10 were successive bilingualism, so they had learned both languages together. 5 were, most of the class had learned both languages together. 5 or something out of that group had done it afterwards. They had achieved mastery in one, and then they had added English, and then the rest only knew one language, either English or Spanish. And then I tried to report findings about what they understood about who spoke English or Spanish around them. And I found out that they were they were completely aware of who spoke English and who didn't speak English, because this was their environment, this was their world, and they needed to know right away if they need milk, what language they need to use in order to get milk. Because I'm the English speaker, I mean, I can say leche, but it's going to go a lot better if they can just be like, hey, I need some milk, and then to somebody else be like, Carrie's leche, you know, something like that. It helps their life a lot more in order to be able to understand that. And so at 3 and 4, they were completely understanding. I probably could have pushed it to 2-year-olds, but it would have been much more difficult to interview 2-year-olds about this. It was kind of a struggle with the 3 and 4-year-olds, I've got to be honest, but I really like that I attempted to get their perspectives and their understandings about this type of stuff. So in conclusion, you as human development majors, you're going to be educators, therapists, social service representatives, health educators, need to practice culturally sensitive care. And with that, you need to recognize and honor the bilingualism of the child, the home language of the child, because this will lead to increased educational and then developmental and then health outcomes for the children. So this week, like normal, you'll do this lecture. I have some readings. I have the weekly article reflection for you guys, and then we'll have a forum as well. We are getting close to the end. We have 1, 2, 3. So I'm going to lecture 3 more weeks. Then we will have a review of the pre-seed proceed model. Then we will have a review of the entire course, and then we will have the final. On May 5th is when your policy paper is due. I have a whole lecture that I did about it 6 weeks or so ago. So if you need to go back and include, of course, I don't shut anything down to be able to see it about your policy paper. I also have a really detailed rubric in the syllabus, and I also have kind of the kind of things that I'm looking for with the pre-seed proceed model and what your paper should be structured like. So please, if you have questions, read the syllabus, look at the lecture, and then email me. Of course, 100% email me so I can guide you and make sure that you're in the right direction as well. So please don't forget about this as we're starting to kind of get in our downward spiral as we kind of finish the class. Please stay on top of those types of things. You guys have been an amazing class, I think. Fantastic. It has been wonderful to work with you guys. The depth of understanding and knowledge and perspective that you have brought has been fantastic. I've loved learning with you guys. So I just want to make sure that you're staying on top of those policy papers, because I'm really looking forward to reading them in early May, and then you guys finishing strong with your final as well, which will be very similar, and then it will be online that last week of finals. We're not going to be meeting anywhere special. It will be online like the midterm was. Thanks so much, and I'll see you in the forums.